But his problem is the same council that's helping him keep a stable, politically operational England is also desperate not to get involved in the tricky business of European politics. Because just as Henry VII and to a lesser extent Edward IV were very careful not to give the French or anybody else reasons to interfere in England, the council are very worried that if you start messing with the big boys, then that could have consequences for England. And for a long time, Henry is very frustrated. Between about 1509 and about 1512, there's no reason for him to go to war. He can't get allies. Who would his allies be? I guess his father-in-law. Remember, he marries Catherine of Aragon after he becomes king, and they're crowned together in June 1509. So it wasn't a decision, for later reference, which was forced on him. He decided to marry Catherine himself. And his father-in-law, Ferdinand of Aragon, is a real political heavyweight and mixer in Europe and is used to making alliances and things. But he's not interested. Another potential ally would be the Holy Roman Emperor, Maximilian von Habsburg, over in the German lands. But he too is not much interested at that time in attacking France. What's clear to Henry and his councillors is that England can't do it by itself. It might have been able to do it a bit in the 15th century, but it really can't do it in the 16th century for reasons which we probably haven't got time to go into now, to do with the cost of armies, armaments, artillery, all these sorts of things. But Henry gets money and invests it in all the potential for war. He does build up pieces of artillery, buys cannons from the Netherlands and the Low Countries, invests in swords, archery, makes proclamations which say that people have to practice archery, the great English skill which they borrowed from the Welsh, I suppose, in fighting the French in the 100 Years' War. He wants all those skills kept up. And as I was saying earlier, jousting after he becomes king, particularly in 1511 when his first son, Prince Henry, who unfortunately dies as a very young child, but when Prince Henry's born, there's a fantastic tournament in which Henry shows off as Sir Loyal Heart, and there's a famous picture of him jousting in front of his wife Catherine. So Henry does absolutely everything he possibly can to show to the nobility of England and to everybody else that he's the man for the job. But there just isn't the reason to go to war. And eventually, the person who begins to notice this and who begins to really work for what the king wants rather than what the council wants is none other than Cardinal Wolsey, or Thomas Wolsey, as he then is, the king's almoner. The almoner was responsible for distributing the king's charity, and it was a sort of sinecurial office. You could make of it as much or as little as you wanted, and Wolsey made a lot of it. He gets appointed to the council, and the person who he listens to most of all on the council is the king. And he very shrewdly sees that if he wants to get ahead himself, that is Wolsey, the best way to do that is to give the king what he wants. And what the king wants is time to go out, enjoy himself, hunting, play around with his friends, do that kind of thing. He's terribly bored very quickly with all the tedious administration, the checking of the accounts, all that sort of thing. The stuff which his father had been very good at, Henry's not so keen on, but Wolsey's very good at it, and so he says, well, leave that to me. You go off and have a lovely time, and I'll look after it for you. And that's essentially what happens. And so it's Wolsey who really begins to see that when the international situation begins to shift, as it does in 1512, in ways which are a bit too complicated to explain, but essentially the King of France falls out with the Pope. Henry is suddenly aware that he's got a reason for war. The king, Louis XII, is declared schismatic, and this means that his kingdom is forfeit and that anybody can take it if they want to. And Henry says, I'm just the man for the job, and this time Ferdinand of Aragon and the Emperor Maximilian are ready for war. So too, perhaps surprisingly, is the English Parliament. In November 1512 it votes him a huge subsidy, a huge amount of money, which he then invests in troops and equipment for a first war. So Henry, finally, after all this waiting since 1509, 1512, he's finally ready to go to war, which he does in 1513, declares war on France and invades France in person in the summer of 1513. And he does a pretty good job. For a first-time king, warrior, He arrives dressed as St. George with a surcoat with the arms of England on it, and very much plays the part of the chivalric warrior prince. And he invades northern France. He takes the town of Terouanne, and also captures the much more important city of Tournai, which was a substantial cloth town and worth a lot of money, very strategically important, on the border between what's now the Netherlands and France. And so he does very well. He doesn't, of course, conquer the Kingdom of France, like Henry V was reputed to have done. There is no great battle of Agincourt where Henry is, proclaimed once more unto the breach, dear friends, and all that sort of stuff that Shakespeare will later make much of. But he does enough to be taken seriously by his contemporaries and his colleagues. There's a famous painting at Hampton Court Palace of Henry meeting with Maximilian and showing him his army and his cavalry and his infantry and all his artillery at the siege of Terouanne. So Henry enhances his reputation, gets taken seriously in Europe, and the fighting season comes to an end. It's once you get into the autumn, it's hard work shifting armies around, and disease starts to be a problem. So the fighting season lasts from late spring to say the middle of autumn, and in accordance with that, Henry goes back to England and is ready, settling down for the winter, ready to finish the job, come back next year, finish the job, and become King of France. And the Pope promises to make him King of France because the Pope thinks it's quite good that he's punishing Louis XII for standing up to him. And it all looks very good for Henry, when suddenly his two allies, Maximilian and Ferdinand of Aragon, decide that they can't be bothered. They've got other things to do. They've got other fish to fry, as it were. And so they, without telling Henry, sign a peace with Louis XII, leaving Henry once more completely isolated. No allies, no real cause for war anymore, and the job only half done. And Henry doesn't know what to do, but Wolsey does. And that's where Henry and Wolsey really start to work very well together. Wolsey had cut his teeth organisationally by being, I suppose he's like the Quartermaster General of the army of 1513, organised the whole operation for Henry. And then, when it all comes to a shuddering halt, and Henry's left alone again, he thinks, well, there's more than one way to skin a cat. Why don't we do to the others what they've done to us? Why don't we make an alliance with France against, who knows, everybody else? But it doesn't really matter, but it'll upset the tables, make you the centre of attention again. And Henry thinks about it for a minute and doesn't really come naturally to him. One of the nobles who, there was a brief battle in 1513 called the Battle of the Spurs, in which Henry captured some nobles outside Terouanne. One of them, the Duc de Longueville, is in England, and he is instructed by his king, Louis XII, to press for peace. And so he asks Henry for a new peace treaty, and guided by Wolsey, Henry decides that if he can't make war in this magnificent, exciting way that he's done, then what he should do is make peace in a magnificent kind of way. And that's what happens. It's called the Treaty of London of 1514, not to be confused with the Treaty of London of 1518, which is a slightly different thing altogether. And by that treaty, Henry is promised, effectively, about £1 million or crowns from the King of France as what he calls tribute for his kingdom, what the French king thinks is money well spent to keep him quiet. And not only that, but his sister, not his daughter, but his sister, Mary Tudor, is by that treaty betrothed to the King of France, Louis XII. So an English princess is going to be Queen of France. An English king might not have conquered the kingdom, but in the international terms, that's a pretty good alliance. And it's totally, because England and France have always been enemies as long as anyone can remember. Suddenly, they are, united, friends, allies. Think of what potential that could do. What could they do? They could attack the Pope, they could attack Spain. Who knows what's going to happen? But that's the point. It just stirs everything up and makes Henry the focus of attention. And so in the autumn of 1514 it's all agreed, and Mary goes over to France and she marries Louis XII. and they're very happily married together. Louis is a much older man, Mary is a young woman, barely 18, renowned for her beauty, so Louis is very happy. I don't think Mary was quite so happy, but at all rates, that's what happens. And who knows what might have happened? Well, what in fact happens is that Mary's husband, Louis XII, dies at the end of December 1514. And there comes to the throne in France a new king, Francis I, who's younger than Henry, just as ambitious, and just as determined to make a name for himself. But that's another story. Because what we're looking at now is 1509 to 1514, and that brings us up to the end of 1514. So in considering how effectively Henry met his aims, I think we need to think about where those aims come from. They come from his childhood, his family, his awareness of the importance for England of the Tudor dynasty. They come from his education as a young boy between the ages of about 7 and 15, 16. They come from his emotional development and upbringing, his imagination, which has been engaged by stories of English victories in France. And they're also formulated by his awareness through training with his father in the last 4 or 5 years of his father's life about what it means to be King of England. So on balance, I think we'd have to say that Henry's fairly successful. If his aims are, as we've said, to establish a new generation of the dynasty, to consolidate the Tudor dynasty in the hearts and minds of the Tudor nobility and the people of England, I think he succeeds very well at that. If his second aim is to maintain continuity and stability in domestic government, in administration, the church, the legal system, then he does that reasonably well, largely by not upsetting anything that his father had done, because Henry VII had spent a lot of time organising all of that. And thirdly, and most importantly for Henry himself, to make a name for himself internationally, he also succeeds there. He may not have been the great victor of Agincourt like Henry V was, he may not have conquered France outright, but he certainly put himself in a position to be taken seriously in Europe, and everywhere by the end of 1514 people were saying, what is this king going to do next? So to my mind, I think he achieves his initial aims fairly well.